And good afternoon, and welcome to the official start of today's WorldOregon webinar. We are thrilled to be joined with the Brookings Institution and some local experts here. We're going to talk about COVID-19, looking at the Portland metro area economy before the pandemic and recession hit, and where it is now and where we might be headed coming out of it. I'm just going to have a few quick opening remarks before we get into the meat of the discussion here. We've got a lot of great facts and figures we want to share with you, and we're looking forward to some really tough audience questions. So get ready to post those in the Q&A function of Zoom. Just a reminder, this is a WorldOregon webinar made possible by members of WorldOregon and other sponsors. If you're not yet a WorldOregon member, I encourage you to do so. That helps us to run programs like this. And in fact, we have a fundraiser coming up April 29th, WorldQuest, which we will post in the chat there. Thanks, Tim. And encourage you to join us. Should be a fun hour-long virtual event with some cool videos and an opportunity for you to support discussions like this and our work to connect Oregon with the world. Before I introduce our speaker, just want to mention we have a lot of great events coming up this week. In fact, we have Cass Sunstein, who is speaking Thursday night on his new book. He is famous, many of you may not realize this, but the spouse of Samantha Power, who spoke for us last year and is a longtime foreign policy expert. And then Friday, we're having a look back at the anniversary of the Bay of Pigs invasion, which would be a fascinating discussion with a Cuba expert. And now to today's program. A reminder, this is a Zoom webinar. All audience members are muted with their video off. The only ones who will be speaking or that you will see our WorldOregon staff and our speakers. You can address questions in the Q&A, and we will be posting in the chat links to some of the documents we're referring to, or events, or other kinds of website reports and such. The heart of today's presentation is from Alan Berube, who's the Deputy Director of the Brookings Institution's Metropolitan Policy Program. He is an old friend and colleague who I've had the joy of working with him and his other colleagues at Brookings Metro in my previous life, working on international aspects of economic development. As I was just saying to Alan before we were starting, one of the things I really love about this part of Brookings is it really dives in at the local and metro and state level in a way that most think tanks don't. They leverage the power of their data and their knowledge to help local areas create strategies to improve their economic growth and also the combat inequality. I'll post later in the chat something called Greater Portland Global, which we put together on a local basis, and I had a small part in that while working at Greater Portland Inc. Thanks in large part to the Brookings work and Prosper Portland's expertise and others in the community. So Alan is a colleague of Amy Liu, the vice president of that section, who you might have seen before speak for Greater Portland Inc.'s Regional Economic Summit. I'm going to ask Alan to give a presentation with his incredible data, talk about this as it compares to national level, and then at the bottom of the hour, we are going to be joined by Monique Claiborne, the new head of Greater Portland Inc., the Regional Economic Development Organization, and Kimberly Branam, the head of Prosper Portland, the City of Portland's economic development arm, for a discussion with Alan and your questions on what this means from a local point of view. So without further ado, Alan, the floor is yours. Thanks so much for joining us.
Hey, thank you so much, Derrick, and to the whole staff at WorldOregon. My colleagues at Brookings Metro always, I think, just benefit a great deal from our interactions with the smart institutions, leaders, people in Greater Portland and in Oregon. So it's a real treat to be with you today. I'm going to, as Derrick noted, share some insights from our work here at Brookings Metro on how the COVID-19 crisis has affected metropolitan economies like Portland's, and indeed what the future may hold. I'm feeling a little auspicious because I just got my first Pfizer shot on Saturday. I had to drive up to Raven Stadium in Baltimore to do so. So that's good, and the azaleas are beginning to bloom here in DC, so I hope you all are seeing signs of rebirth, renewal in the city of roses as well. So on to the presentation. I thought I would try to share some insights in three basic areas today. First, I want to offer our sense of the pre-pandemic baseline in the Portland area regarding economic growth and who it was reaching. Second, I want to share what we're seeing in the data as to the region's experience during the pandemic economic crisis compared to other large metropolitan areas like it around the country. And third, I'll speculate a bit on what might come next, including policy opportunities that cities and regions have, importantly, to facilitate an inclusive economic recovery. So to begin with where Portland was before the crisis, we often use insights from our Metro Monitor research to assess metropolitan economies' performance. So the Metro Monitor defines economic success in a way that recognizes the importance of economic growth and expanding economy, expanding opportunities for workers and businesses, but also acknowledges that growth is a means rather than an end. Economic development also implies increasing the average productivity and value of a local economy over time, and ensuring that residents benefit from that growth regardless of income, regardless of race, regardless of place. And so we shorthand this success model as inclusive economic growth. We operationalize the definition through 5 categories and 15 different indicators. You don't need to memorize them all, but I want to emphasize that importantly, we break out that inclusion theme into 3 subcategories that focus respectively on overall inclusive outcomes, and those that reflect outcomes for white workers versus workers of color, we call that racial inclusion, and wealthy neighborhoods versus poor neighborhoods, we call that geographic inclusion. And we measure those outcomes for the 192 metropolitan areas in the United States that have at least 250,000 residents. We do so separately for the 53 very large metro areas, we call them, that include Portland. These are places with at least 1 million residents. So the latest edition of the Monitor tracks the trajectory of these metropolitan economies beginning in 2009, which was really the trough of the Great Recession, through 2019, which in essence was the peak of the pre-pandemic economy in the United States. So this slide shows where the Portland metro area ranked among its 53 size peers in each of those 5 Metro Monitor categories from 2009 to 2019. And so you can see overall, Portland was a very strong performer on growth, prosperity, and overall inclusion, an okay performer, I would say, on racial inclusion, and a weak performer on geographic inclusion. So I'll take a look at an indicator from each of these categories in turn that I think helps explain Portland's pre-pandemic economic performance. So first, over the 2010s, economic growth was relatively strong in the Portland metro area. You can see particularly after 2013, when the region began to outpace national and metropolitan averages on job growth. Indeed, the Portland metro area by 2019 had 23% more jobs than it did in the year 2009. Second, prosperity, or the average value of the economy for workers and residents, also increased more rapidly in Portland in the 2010s than in other regions. So for instance, the standard of living depicted here, that's essentially the per person value of Portland's total economic output, increased very rapidly beginning in the mid-2010s after it actually had stagnated in the early part of the decade. Third, Portland was actually the strongest performer among all 53 very large metropolitan areas on overall inclusion, which measures the benefits of economic growth that are accruing to people in the middle to bottom parts of the economic distribution. So one key measure in this area is what we call the relative poverty rate. That's the share of all workers in the metropolitan area who are earning less than half of the median area earnings. The rate of those workers, so the share of all workers who were earning less than 50% at area median, dropped from 28% in 2009 to about 22% in 2019. You can see on the chart the considerable progress that the region made just in the last 2 years of that period, in 2018 and 2019, when a really tight labor market helped to push up wages and employment opportunity for the lowest paid workers and workers on the sidelines of the economy. Turning fourth to racial inclusion, Portland was more of a, as I said, a middling performer in this area, which measures changes in the economic gaps between white workers and workers of color. Interestingly, you can see here that workers of color, depicted on the orange line, made solid earnings progress in Portland in the 2010s, with median earnings increasing by about $9,000 over the decade when adjusted for inflation. But so too did white workers make a lot of progress, such that the earnings gap between the two groups was roughly unchanged from the beginning of that period to the end of that period. That noted, performance on the Metro Monitor is based on changes in the underlying indicators that we look at. It's also, I think, useful to understand what the levels look like, the levels of disparity between white workers and workers of color. So to that end, this slide shows the disparity between employment rates, median earnings, and relative poverty rates for white workers and workers of color in the Portland area as of 2019. And while median earnings differences do remain large at roughly about $11,000 a year, I think it's really notable that Portland actually possesses, at least pre-pandemic, smaller disparities in each of these economic regards by race than most other large metropolitan areas do. It ranks in the top third in each category in terms of the size of that disparity. The one area of the monitor, as I noted, in which Portland really fell convincingly short of its peers was in geographic inclusion. That measures the changes in the economic disparities between the region's most advantaged and least advantaged neighborhoods. So in this category, Portland was 45th among the 53 very large metropolitan areas. It actually had a ranking similar to several other what you might call tech-influenced regions like the San Francisco Bay Area, Seattle, and Boston. So by way of illustration, these maps show the distribution of the region's highest income and lowest income neighborhoods, first in 2009 on this slide, and then in 2019 on this slide. And so if I could just flip back and forth one more time, you can see within the city of Portland, which is just to the south of the river here, high income neighborhoods further concentrating in blue around the downtown and toward the west of the city and the region, and then lower income neighborhoods concentrating toward the east. And we measured that in these lower income communities in the aggregate, median household income did rise over the decade by about $6,000 to $48,000 median by 2019. But it rose by more than twice that margin in these high income communities by about $14,000 over the decade, such that the median household income in those neighborhoods in 2019 was $118,000, so $70,000 higher than it was in those least advantaged bottom 20% of neighborhoods. So together, I think these data, for me, paint a portrait of a region that I think in a lot of respects was on an upward trajectory of inclusive economic growth in the 2010s, which showed some worrying signs of these emerging spatial divides that can pose longer-term threats to regional economic health, upward mobility, and in fact, the goal of equitable access to opportunity. Okay, so that provides, I think, and I hope, a useful baseline for considering the economic impacts of the COVID-19 crisis on the Portland region relative to some of its peer regions around the country. We are officially more than 1 year into the pandemic crisis now. And so I think it's helpful to reflect back on the economic picture as it began, as we entered the crisis. As Portland's own experience in the 2010s reflects, we were experiencing a record run of job growth in the United States with increased employment at the national level every single month dating back to sometime in the year 2010. The unemployment rate, the headline unemployment rate, albeit it's an imperfect measure, it had dipped below 4%. And as we saw in the Portland example, earnings have really finally begun to increase significantly for lower income workers, for workers of color. And then, of course, overnight, at least in economic terms, the bottom fell out. It literally broke our charts at Brookings and many peer organizations who do this kind of work. We never experienced anything, change at anything close to this scale, especially in such a short amount of time. And there was really genuine, not just uncertainty, but dread at the thought that we could be headed not only for this unprecedented challenge to public health, before another protracted and inequitable recovery like the one that we saw follow the Great Recession. And so late last spring, we stood up this new tool at Brookings called the Metro Recovery Index. So this actually tracks the progress of those same 192 metropolitan areas from the Metro Monitor, but on a month-to-month rather than year-to-year basis. It examines easily accessible to us indicators across three categories: the labor market, the real estate market, and then a set of broader indicators of economic activity. At the time when we set this up, we really had no idea how long the acute economic effects of the pandemic were going to persist, and then what direction in particular the residential real estate market would take. Seriously, no idea about that. Nevertheless, though, I think the index has shed some useful light on the experiences and the differences in those experiences across major metropolitan economies over the last year. So this is a snapshot of the impact of the pandemic on the Portland area economy. I want to encourage the audience not to focus on the exact numbers here, but rather on the colors, where the pink and the red indicators suggest that compared to other very large metropolitan areas, the impacts of the pandemic in Portland relative to the region's own baseline, so that pre-pandemic baseline, have actually been more pronounced and more negative in some ways. So I think Portland is actually not unlike a lot of other sort of white collar dominated coastal cities, in that it has this economic duality. Has a large number of professional workers still employed but working remotely, combined with a lot of small businesses that used to cater to a lot of those workers too, that have shuttered or seriously cut back their hours. So both of those dynamics have then in turn contributed to an above average rise, for instance, in the region's commercial vacancy rate that we've seen in compared to other metropolitan areas. That picture is in turn consistent with where the region has seen the most pronounced job losses. So between February of 2020 and February of 2021, that's the most recent available data for metropolitan areas, almost half of the net job loss in the Portland region has come in the hospitality sector. So hotels, restaurants, bars, arts and entertainment as well. Government, education, and healthcare have accounted for the other most heavily impacted sectors. The region today actually, interestingly enough, has more jobs than it did prior to the crisis in transportation, which I really see as the result of a historic increase in online commerce occurring in your region and many, many others. The index itself, it does not have the kind of frequent, reliable, geographically specific data to track the recession and the recovery's impact on different populations. But we know from other data sources that this has been what some are calling the most inequitable downturn in US history. The pronounced impacts on the hospitality and as well the retail sectors have meant that at the national level, and then we see this in data actually for Oregon displayed here too from the Census Bureau, that workers experiencing earnings and employment loss over the past year have been disproportionately Hispanic. They possess no more than a high school diploma. They have children at home and they have lower incomes. So I think these impacts, and I hope we'll return to this in the discussion, should be really top of mind as communities begin to assemble strategies, priorities, and then execute on those around the recovery. So again, we'll talk a little bit more about that, I hope, in a moment. My final data and sort of reflection in this section is that, while these overall impacts of the pandemic on some aspects of the Portland economy have been really significant and negative, the region actually seems to be right now in a more positive trajectory than other places. So jobs over the past couple of months have continued to rebound. Job openings levels remain very strong. Small businesses have begun to reopen at a considerable clip relative to other places. So another thing that we're seeing is that unlike in some other tech cities, again, like San Francisco or Boston or New York, rent prices in the Portland area seem to have held fairly steady as well. There still are not a lot of people traveling to and from Portland by air, and workers are not yet returning in droves to their offices, but I expect that we'll see more movement in those numbers over the next few months. So just sort of summing up this section and stepping back to reflect on the bottom line for the Portland experience during the pandemic, I do think it mirrors those that we've seen in other similar regions that, have thus far taken a somewhat more cautious approach to reopening than we've seen in other regions of the country, particularly the South and portions of the Midwest. There are more positive signs as of late, but of course there are certain segments of the population in the economy, particularly Hispanic workers and families, and then workers and small businesses in the hospitality sector that are still quite some ways from getting towards a recovery, and certainly a full recovery. So that leads into the final part of my presentation. I've labeled it "What's Next," but it's in truthfulness is really about what's now. Wonks like myself shy away from too much prediction, but I think the what's next will be an important topic for the discussion to follow. So I hope this tees that up. So the first thing to know is that for those who actually are in the prediction business, they are expecting a relatively robust economic rebound in 2021. They are projecting 5.5% GDP growth this year in 2021. That would be 2.5 times the rate that we saw in 2019. And that was a projection based on really, I think, reasonable assumptions about the rate of vaccinations we're currently delivering in the United States and the level of fiscal aid delivered in this new American Rescue Plan Act, which I'll return to in a second. We've seen actually in the Metro Recovery Index that throughout the pandemic, one of the most reliable predictors of short-run labor market and economic activity performance at the metropolitan level has been the virus itself and the prevalence of the virus in local communities. And in Portland, that is a very positive trajectory at the moment. The average daily rate of new COVID-19 cases in the region in March fell to levels seen, I think, last fall, even as the virus and the variants, as you all are probably seeing, have led to new spikes elsewhere in the country. Portland actually had the second lowest average daily rate of new COVID-19 cases among the 53 very large metropolitan areas that we tracked in the month of March. What might the medium term look like? So the Federal Bureau of Labor Statistics actually recently published estimates of what might be the longer running impacts of the pandemic, looking at different sectors of the economy. And they expect that it may lead to structural declines in the demand for workers, at least over the next decade, in sectors like accommodation and food services, arts and entertainment, retail, and construction. But they also expect that it might have positive and salutary effects in sectors like professional, scientific, and technical services, information. So you put those two things together, they have somewhat countervailing effects in a region like Portland, which has both of these things. So by my colleagues' calculations at Brookings, the region may see perhaps a longer run reduction in employment on the order of 1% to 2% versus what it might have expected in the absence of the pandemic economic crisis. But suffice it to say, there's a lot that we still don't know, but this bears keeping in mind and looking at in more detail as we go forward. So those are some of the dynamics I see on the macroeconomic side. At the same time, there have been huge new fiscal developments, none larger than the $1.9 trillion American Rescue Plan Act that was just passed into law last month. The most notable part of that package is $350 billion in flexible aid to state, local, and tribal governments. I'll say more about that in a second. Those resources in turn sit alongside an even larger package of investments in this act that also have implications for efforts to ensure recovery and indeed an inclusive and equitable economic recovery. So a range of formula grants to states for K through 12 schools, childcare, rental assistance, capital projects, grants to other public and nonprofit authorities like public health agencies, colleges and universities, transit agencies, some specific funding for small businesses, including some more money for the Paycheck Protection Program, the State Small Business Credit Initiative, And then actually a wide range of competitive grant programs for which businesses, public agencies, school districts, other intermediaries need to apply. For instance, many of you may know that there is $29 billion in aid set aside for restaurants and bars, $16 billion for shuttered arts venues, both of those programs administered by the Small Business Administration. On those flexible state and local resources, the Act provides actually a total of $130 billion in flexible fiscal resources to counties and cities, which most are going to use to address budget shortfalls they incurred as a result of the pandemic, but they'll also have significant resources left over once they cover those shortfalls. This table just shows the direct allocations that counties in the region and the largest cities in the region are going to receive directly this year, one half of the funding, and then next year, the other half from the American Rescue Plan Act. The city of Portland is receiving the single largest allocation in the region, roughly $218 million over those 2 years. My colleagues, Brad Whitehead and Joe Perilla at Brookings recently offered, I think, a useful framework that local leaders can adopt to deploy this flexible funding wisely. And as I mentioned, certainly the first priority is going to be shoring up fiscal issues, restoring the kinds of vital services and personnel that they had to pare back in response to the pandemic crisis. But then the second priority really ought to be to strategize with particular attention to the needs of the workers and businesses who are most affected by the crisis. Some of those workers and businesses need immediate help in order to hang on and remain a meaningful part of the recovery. As we saw from the CARES Act, the big package passed in the spring of 2020, local leaders are going to need partners who have reach and relationships in the most impacted communities in order to help deliver equitable and inclusive investment. And then unlike CARES, ARPA provides a real opportunity to invest for the longer term. Cities, counties, states have until 2024 to spend these dollars, unlike the year that they were initially given to spend the CARES Act dollars. So they can boost existing efforts that need scale, and they can leverage the flexible federal fiscal aid with those other categorical and competitive programs available in the wider package. And then throughout all this, Brad and Joe observed that the civic sector, those non-governmental intermediaries that connect the public, the private, the nonprofit, have a critical role to play in creating some visibility, transparency, and accountability around those decisions, and should be resourced to do so by public, private, and philanthropic partners. Final note here is that, while communities consider the opportunities, the priorities associated with the American Rescue Plan Act, we've already moved on in Washington to the next big debate around the next big move from the federal government, the Biden administration and Congress. This is what the Biden administration is calling its America Jobs Plan, and it proposes to invest $2.2 trillion in what you might call both hard and soft infrastructure with the aims of creating good jobs, connecting communities, and combating climate change. The investment areas in the plan fall into the sort of four general, kind of broad, sometimes categories depicted in the different colors here in this chart. I think it's important for folks to know that this is the administration's plan, right? But the House and the Senate are going to have their own versions, and then the negotiation over the size, the scope, whether and how to pay for this, that's going to continue throughout the summer and probably into the fall before it reaches any sort of final resolution. But to the extent that there may be overlaps in areas, say capital investment, workforce development, affordable housing, between priorities that communities are pursuing through the American Rescue Plan Act dollars and this forthcoming package, I think those local leaders will do really well to pay attention to and articulate their priorities to members of Congress and the administration. So just in summation, my bottom line on what's next, I'm really looking forward to hearing from Kimberly and Monique and others on this, is that Portland, by all accounts here, by our data, by our measures, is poised for a strong rebound. But in order to really address the inequities that were brought on by the pandemic, as well as the pre-existing inequities that we had seen in the city and the region, particularly across neighborhoods, local leaders are going to need to be strategic and intentional in making use of the significant new and forthcoming federal resources. So I will end there. thank you again for letting me be with you. I'm really findable on the interweb, but this is my contact information. I'll find a way to share the slides too. Please tweet at me all you like today and going forward. Thanks.
Alan, thanks so much for that impressive amount of data done in an understandable way. And I look forward to some great questions from the audience. I know we have a lot of top-notch economic development professionals from the region, so I expect you to put our leaders on, keep them on their toes. In the meantime, I'm just gonna reintroduce Kimberly Branam, the head of Prosper Portland, the City of Portland's economic development arm, and Monique Claiborne, who is the new CEO of Greater Portland Inc. And full disclosure, I used to work for Greater Portland Inc., so it's exciting to see Monique in her role. And we asked the two of them to be able to talk about this from, rounding out the sort of local perspective. And I think maybe first question I'll put to you, Kimberly, Monique, as Alan was saying, is how do you bridge that tackling some of these pre-existing inequities in the region that, like so much else in COVID, were really laid bare, the inequalities? Yeah, how do we tackle some of those coming out of it? And to what extent do you think this federal assistance, either the already appropriated or the future possible, will be key to that effort? And maybe Kimberly and then Monique.
Well, thanks, Derrick, and good afternoon. It's great to be with you all, and appreciate WorldOregon for hosting this. And I always appreciate Brookings. Sometimes being in the civic space and in economic development at a local level can feel almost lonely, or that you're facing this kind of just as a region. And it's very helpful to get a broader perspective of what's happening with the rest of the country and recognize that we are not alone. So thanks so much for the opportunity. The question in terms of how do we bridge or how do we acknowledge and what are we doing collectively, given that we've had such a challenging last 12 months economically in our region, and that there were pre-existing inequalities that have been so exacerbated. What do we do about that? And I think that really is the central question that we've been wrestling with. And Prosper Portland has been working very closely with our partners at Greater Portland Inc. And across the city, with the public and the private sector, to think about how, what is the role that we can do? What can we play? And so Alan mentioned the CARES Act funding, and that was an area where we really used a racial equity lens to identify how we could, at a local level, support Black, Indigenous, and people of color owned small businesses who we knew were disproportionately disadvantaged from accessing the first round of the PPP grants and other federal funds. We created a small business relief fund that was really geared towards supporting women-owned and BIPOC-owned businesses. And I think we are going to continue to do that as we look for the opportunities to invest American Rescue Plan Act dollars. This is something that is a huge priority for the city of Portland, is really making sure that we recover equitably. And I think in order to do that, you have to apply a racial equity lens, and you also need to be engaged really directly with communities, and to resource, as I think Alan mentioned, those community organizations that are closest to those businesses that have long-term relationships. And so that's something that we've seen in the planning for our economic recovery. So at a regional level, the comprehensive economic development strategy has significant representation from diverse communities, from chambers of commerce, with important ties. And that's something that I think we will continue to need to foster, to make sure that we are not overtaxing those organizations that are really on the front lines. And that's something that I think hopefully with the American Rescue Plan Act dollars, we will have some resources to put behind.
Yeah, I'd like to add too that I think it's important that I think what we'll see in the rebound is this fierce competitiveness for attracting businesses. And for Greater Portland Inc., who is the regional economic development agency for business recruitment, I think it becomes extremely important for us to be intentional in the businesses and industries that we're bringing to the region. Those in the traded sector are critical, because not only do you bring in new money into the economy, right, but then you're also keeping the money in the local economy that's already here. And so that's our charge at Greater Portland Inc., is to bring jobs into the region, and do it, as Kimberly said, with an equity lens, and making sure that those communities and populations from historically marginalized and underserved are part of the strategy, and they're part of the rebound in the region.
So if I could jump in here, I know, Alan, you answered some of this in the chat, but we got a question about most heavily impacted cities, and if you could maybe just expand on what you put in the Q&A. And I know the Metro Monitor is focused domestically, but are there lessons you're seeing globally as far as the type of economy that's going to be slower to recover? You know, will a Tokyo recover faster than, say, a Rio de Janeiro or something like that, or is it too early to say?
That's a good question. I mean, I can so starting with the U.S. experience and the sort of prognostications and what they're based on. The regions that have been most heavily impacted by the crisis, and where the effects of that impact may be most long-lasting, are those, not surprisingly, that had a heavy reliance on sectors like hospitality, accommodation, food service, retail, and then construction too, given what might be a protracted slowdown in, say, commercial development, as a lot of businesses sort of rethink their need for and use of space. So those are regions, like, again, unsurprisingly, places like Orlando, Florida, Las Vegas, Nevada, Honolulu, Hawaii, as well as a lot of other small and mid-sized regions with a heavy reliance on the tourism sector. As regards the sort of the cities with a more diversified and global orientation, I would put Portland in that category. But your peers like Seattle and Boston and San Diego, and I think there's been a lot of words written about the future of the American city, and will people come back to cities, and do people need cities anymore? And nobody knows the answer for sure about that yet. We just know what history has taught us, which is that lots of other tragedies have befallen, big cities across the sweep of human civilization, and yet we still build cities and people still live in cities. And deurbanization has only kind of been a thing in the Western world over the last 50, 60 odd years as we built suburbia. But there was actually, as I think a lot of your audience will know, like a significant reurbanization, economic reurbanization happening in the lead up to the pandemic economic crisis in cities and regions like Portland that had, I'd say, a significant foothold in the advanced sectors of the economy. So a lot remains to be seen, but I wouldn't be the first person to sort of bet against history and as such to sort of bet against cities as places that people need to gather to create innovation, economic value, but also just to create human connection, and because we're social animals at the end of the day.
Maybe I could follow on those very good comments and just ask our two local leaders here. I mean, there's been a lot of, I think, angst, not only in Portland, but in other parts of the U.S. of, challenges the city's had regarding homeless, and being able to provide services and assistance to them. And then with some of the, protests that not the peaceful ones, obviously, but some of the violent protests, there's been questions about that and whether that scare off either business investors or just, tourists or people shopping. I mean, to what extent, in addition to things that you could really track and monitor that you had in your stats, are you concerned as local economic development leaders about the perception and what the reputation is, and how important is that, or is that overblown as a concern? I'll open up maybe first to Monique and then to Kimberly.
Yeah, sure. So there was a study that came out a couple of months ago. I'm not going to quote the source because I may not be right, but Portland was actually one of the top cities for new hires or new talent moving into the city, right? And so I think what's important to note is that Portland's still cool. Portland's still a desirable region. And even in spite of the pandemic and the stay-at-home order, we had people moving here, right? And so I think that plays to our strengths. So that's number one. I think two, we have inequities here, right? And we're aware of what they are. But I think from a business attraction standpoint, while we may not have a huge influx of relocation, companies that come here, they're Portlanders who really are, working there, right? And so it's not like you have these new people coming into the city and, hey, I don't want to be here, and it's this poor image, right? We're here, we're dealing with the crisis, where it's not new to us, and so I think you'll still have companies expanding here, you'll still have companies staying here, right? And you'll still see the hiring of local Portlanders.
Yeah, I agree with Monique. I think our long-term, I think we've seen some good trends in the last few months, but I do think that that long-term we're in a really good position in terms of investment and attractiveness. I do think that, our reputation took a hit. I think that there's a lot of concern locally, particularly in the city of Portland, about, what kind of activity people are seeing. And frankly, I think a lot of it for Central City has to do with the fact that you have a lot of office workers who are working from home. And so there's not a lot of positive activity. And we are looking very closely at what happens when you get to herd immunity and when people come back. I think that'll be a really important kind of demarcation or milestone. We're looking maybe around Labor Day that people will be coming back, and that'll be great for the local businesses. I think that's one of the things that we know about our tourism industry is that people come not for some fancy kind of experience, but or a particular iconic experience, but really to engage in the Portland experience of our local small businesses, our great main streets, our beautiful environment. And so I think we're hopeful that when you have more people who are downtown, that our downtown businesses will be able to be supported and will be coming back. But I know that Mayor Wheeler and a number of civic leaders are really looking at how do we engage in telling our story, make sure that we're counteracting any mythologies, and then also that we are doing the work that we need to do as a city to clean up and to kind of get ourselves ready for that moment when hopefully people are able to go back into the office in whatever new form that looks like.
So I'm a native Detroiter, and I did business attraction in Detroit during the largest municipal bankruptcy, right? A global recession, a shrinking automotive industry. And when I talk to my Detroit economic development friends, they'll say Portland doesn't have an image crisis. Portland doesn't have the issues, the systemic issues that Detroit had. And I think what we can do is learn from other regions, right? And see how they were able to turn around. And I think one thing, and I'll piggyback off of what Kimberly said, is there's certainly a desire, there's a level of passion for those that are involved now that have rolled up their sleeves and they're saying, hey, we're going to do something about this, we're on it, right? We're not going to let this persist for decades before we now get involved. And so I think because you have that level of intentionality, we'll see a lot of changes, again, how we're going to utilize the dollars that are coming in, the federal dollars, again, the private funds. I think you're going to see a real deliberate engagement from the private sector and philanthropic community as well.
So Alan, maybe you could comment. I mean, I see these sort of contrasting, bits of news where I just got an alert right before we started from Portland Business Journal estimating that more than 1,000 Oregon restaurants have closed since 2020. On the other hand, I heard something not too long ago on NPR's Marketplace about how there's been surge in new business that is nationwide developed. I mean, are these people whose one business didn't work out and they're trying something new, or is this economy so disruptive it's now pulling people into entrepreneurial space? Has Brookings been able to see what, pin together what's going on here?
Yeah, it's a good question. And so the short answer is no, not exactly, right? But I think I'm just sort of reflecting how I mean, small business is having its moment right now, right? It's like for anybody who ever sort of took that part of the economy for granted, like now we're having a lot of like, the pandemic has shown a spotlight on the vulnerabilities of that sector and some of the characteristics of that sector. One is that it's like there's always a lot of churn in the small business sector, a lot of starts, a lot of failures, a lot of serial entrepreneurs who, you know, who count failure as a sort of good thing and they're sort of moving on to the next thing. You know, but I think the principle that has applied throughout the pandemic is there's creative destruction, right? Like you try an idea, it didn't work, but you learn from it and made your next idea and your next venture better. And destructive destruction, like you had a great idea and then through no fault of your own because of a global pandemic, your business failed. And so the first thing that public policy has to do is avert the destructive destruction and help bridge people irrespective of the quality of their ideas. Like we're not here to judge that right now. We're just trying to make sure that you know, economic tragedy doesn't befall you and your workers through no fault of your own. But yeah, like I think, you know, once we get to that other side, you know, and it's not like there's a side, it's like you sort of cross the bridge, like, okay, now we're post-pandemic. It is a process, but I think the kind of timeline that Kimberly was just referring to is the one most folks have in mind. I do think there is like a lot of pent up energy among the entrepreneurs, you know, in every big city around the country who maybe had good ideas and are seeing new opportunities that are, you know, maybe in some respects created by the pandemic, like sitting on the sidelines waiting for sort of the green light and the macroeconomic picture and the public health picture improve, and are waiting with that idea in the wings, looking for the capital, looking for the partners to execute on it. So I don't know. I guess I'm expressing that as long as we can sustain the folks who are just sort of hanging on right now, trying to get to the other side, that there's actually additional new energy waiting in the small business sector that I think we can be hopeful about as well.
I don't know if Kimberly and Monique, you want to comment from the local perspective regarding small businesses, or?
Well, you know, so I've seen some data that suggests that we saw about an 80% increase in small business cessation. So not closure necessarily, but just that they laid off all their employees if they had employees over the last year. And that number is obviously almost twice of what we had seen the year before, but it's not 7 times. And so, you know, somewhere in between a really terrible position and not as bad as it could have been is probably where we are. And I do think it really depends on what sector you're in. If you're in retail and clothing, it's really challenging. Restaurants, you know, have been in a tough spot. I think that you know, I am heartened by what the Biden administration put forward and what Congress passed. I do think that small business will be supported by the ARPA, but I agree with Alan that, you know, it's been really challenging. And, you know, we even saw small business closures in veterinarians and some dentists early on, right? Because they were challenged by some of the restrictions. So I think, you know, hopefully people will get back on their feet. Hopefully the supports that we have will support the majority. But I do worry about people who are going to be going into business just because they can't find other employment opportunities, or who are permanently kind of where their business is no longer a going concern through no fault of their own. And so that's something that I think, to the extent that the Small Business Administration's funds aren't appropriate, that's something that the city should be looking at, or we should be looking at as the state, as a way to support.
And I think that's a really important observation, Kimberly, about you know, small business starts, what they may or may not actually indicate, and is it entrepreneurialism of opportunity or entrepreneurialism as a last resort? And I think regarding that sort of second category, I think, you know, having a sort of intentional strategy, a focused strategy around the hospitality workforce, which may take, again, some time to sort of get back up to its pre-pandemic level, workers and families to get back on their feet. I think, communities, and this maybe connects to one of the things in the Q&A around the Greater Portland Lake Recovery Plan. I think we're seeing some communities sort of begin to think intentionally in a focused way about that workforce. What skills do they have? What skills do they need to bridge to other more in-demand sectors? How can we align short-term, medium-run training opportunities for those workers that help them pivot to those in-demand sectors? Because it is a sort of large enough and coherent enough workforce that may be looking for those opportunities for some time, that I think cities and regions would be well served to really train a spotlight on that section of the displaced labor force.
Some great comments. I have a question we use as a follow-up on that, and first to Alan, and then ask Kimberly and Monique to comment on. It's from one of our colleagues at Metro, our unique tri-county government that does a lot of our regional transportation, economic development work with land use planning and other things. Our region established a Greater Portland Economic Recovery Plan that contains immediate actions as a response to economic conditions associated with the pandemic. Can you compare this to what other regions around the U.S. have been able to establish to support recovery efforts? And questioner asks, particularly in guiding federal and other investment in infrastructure and resources. So maybe, Alan, if you could maybe comment what you might have seen in other metro areas, and Kimberly and Monique, your two organizations involved in this effort, maybe you could just comment from the local to inform our audience better what's involved in this recovery plan.
Yeah, and I actually did take a look at the plan before our session today, and I think it deserves a ton of credit just for sort of laying out some very clear priorities and then thinking about the actual sort of tactics and strategies that you might pursue under those priorities. So I think the region deserves kudos on that, and then I think in particular sort of deserves credit for thinking about doing it at a point where it can sort of actually envisage the recovery and what that might look like. A lot of regions did this like in May of 2020, right? Where we need a strategy, we need to get our act together, we need to set out like the basic thinking about what's going on here and how we're just going to get through the crisis. But there haven't been as many regions, frankly, that have returned to this question recently and thought about, okay, so what are the 4 or 5 most important things for us to focus together on, and indeed to apply this new flexible federal funding towards, to get our region not just back where it was, but again to address some of the challenges that these regions face even going into the crisis. So I think the one question, and maybe Monique would want to talk about this, but I think the question that maybe Greater Portland will want to ask itself is sort of not only, what are the things that we need to do to restore the kind of, economic vitality that we were, I think, experiencing before the pandemic, but what really will be the drivers of the quote unquote future Portland economy, and how are we going to make sure that investment supports those, and that a broad range of workers and communities are able to connect to opportunities in those new pillars of the economy.
I know, I totally agree. And so that's on my list of things to do, right? As we take into account this tremendous opportunity, right, that we have before us. Another role of GPI is to really be a convener, right? And to look at lessons learned from the CARE Acts, right? And so now pulling together all of our public partners to say, hey, what are you doing with your dollars? Where is it going to go, right? And can we look at these Venn diagrams, these heat maps, and say, hey, where's the largest impact? So we're not being duplicative in our efforts, and we can have really the strongest impact in the region.
Just one interesting example I heard just before I forget it. we talked to partners in the Columbus region the other day, and you might remember some of those folks, Derrick, from our time together in the Global Cities Initiative. But that too is a sort of multi-county region. It's not 2 states, so you have that additional complexity. But you know, as a convener for that region, the sort of business leadership group is looking to see whether the counties might set aside a portion of their American Rescue Plan Act allocations to create a pooled fund for projects and priorities that are really truly regional in nature and would benefit the whole of the region, but which each individual county might not sort of take on its own.
I'll maybe just add appreciation for Greater Portland Inc. and to Metro, who have been stewarding the region's work in terms of coming up with a recovery plan. I've had the privilege of being able to chair that organization that's come together to do it, and just note that there's been really a focus on supporting small businesses, on helping advance economic mobility for individuals. I think the workforce component of it and retraining, as Alan mentioned, is incredibly important and something that we need additional resources to do. And then really supporting families and children. We haven't talked too much about it, but the number of women who have been dislocated, largely both because of the industries that have been most impacted, but also because of childcare concerns, is really something that I think we need to wrestle with collectively. So I feel like we do have a good blueprint for the next few months. And you know, as we get convened across the region, I'm looking forward to understanding what the state's priorities are going to be and what other cities are planning to do. Because I do think a lot of this ends up being, you know, we have a regional labor shed, and you know, so we need to come together collectively to solve these.
So we're almost out of time, so I'm going to combine 2 questions into one. We had somebody commenting about, you know, the climate impacts of the economic downturn, and someone else asked about which industries with Black, Indigenous, people of color leadership or owned do you see most poised for growth in post-pandemic? And I thought maybe Kimberly, you might be able to talk a little bit about the Portland Climate Fund. I mean, there was a big story in the Portland Business Journal about that, and how that may be combining those 2 aspects. And then after you comment, I just ask maybe you and Alan and Monique, if you have something hopeful that we can look forward to, you know, whether it's in that sector or another sector. I think it would be great. You know, what could be possibly a good news item to be looking for as we start to recover?
Sure. So the Portland Clean Energy Fund put out, I think, almost $9 million. Just City Council just appropriated that, and you know, the Clean Energy Fund is a fund that is meant to address climate change and particularly to support local nonprofit organizations that are doing this work. And so I think you're going to see some really exciting things come out of that. I think next year there's something like $60 million that are available. I know that we've been heartened to see that there's been some reduction in greenhouse gases with people traveling less. And I think one of the areas of focus that I know continues to be a priority is making sure that that TriMet and other, you know, that people get back to taking public transportation, so that we're not all now in our cars, which would be devastating for our climate change objectives once we get back into going into the office, or once many folks do. So, you know, I would love to have, I know we're close to time, but would love to have a broader conversation just around what the administration's infrastructure bill might do in terms of furthering a not only inclusive, but really a climate just recovery and the opportunities that are created. I think Portland is well positioned given our competitive advantage in green cities, products and services. So I guess that's, to me, a place that is really hopeful. I think we can take advantage of that. It's an area that Portlanders and Oregonians are very passionate about. And so I'm hopeful that as we see significant investments and potentially new policies, that'll help us in terms of our economic recovery.
Great, thanks. Maybe Monique and then Alan.
Yeah, so what we're trying to do now is look at different data points to say so we can track and track our progress and our recovery for job growth. And one of those data points is the impact on BIPOC community, right? And so what exactly that looks like, more to come, but we want to make sure that we are intentional in job growth projections specifically for this area in micro, very micro. And so more to come on what that looks like, but it is a priority of our organization.
Great, thanks. And now I'll give you the final word.
Kimberly unwittingly stole the same thing that I'm hopeful about, which is the region's, global leadership in, clean energy, efficiency, et cetera. Brookings was proud to be there at the birth of the kind of We Build Green Cities brand for Portland, and it's even more true today, I think, than before. So all of these, major proposed federal investments in infrastructure resilience, greening the grid, clean drinking water. I just think there are just innumerable opportunities for a region that has really best-in-class businesses, some of the globe's most talented workers in that sector. So I am hopeful. I'm hopeful that something will get done on this in Washington, and that will actually redound, especially to the benefit of communities like Portland that are not only good at it, but evince a commitment to making sure that that is a diverse and inclusive sector of the economy as well.
Well said. Thank you to you, Alan, as our speaker, and Monique and Kimberly for the great question and answers. Thanks for the challenging questions from the audience. And really appreciate, especially the wide economic development community. Recognize many names in the audience here. And as I was mentioning to everyone in the prep, I would be remiss as a nonprofit leader without encouraging you to come join our fundraiser to help make conversations like this possible. We'll be having it at the end of the month, April 29th. It's a free event online. I hope that you consider supporting this work and the work we do with international visitors and K-12 education to foster discussions about our region and our state's role in the world, and how we bring in, great expertise like Brookings to help, head us in an even more equitable and prosperous future. So a big thank you to all of you. Thanks for joining. This recording will be posted later onto YouTube. I know we already had some requests from that, and so it will be available for you and your colleagues to watch later. Thanks again. Stay safe, stay healthy. Bye-bye.
Take care. Thank you.